Steven Seagal walked into the small roadside diner quietly. No bodyguards. No entourage. No flashing cameras or headlines announcing his arrival. Just a black leather jacket, faded jeans, and calm, steady eyes that had seen decades of martial arts, action, and law enforcement. He sat at a corner booth, sipping his coffee, completely unassuming. The kind of guy people wouldn't notice, unless they already knew. At the counter, a group of young men laughed loudly. They were loud, brash, and full of the kind of arrogance only youth can produce. One of them leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Hey, old man," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Nice ponytail. Where'd you learn to tie that, grandma?" The others laughed harder. Steven didn't flinch. He didn't look up. He just sipped his coffee slowly, like time itself didn't matter. But the tallest one, clearly the leader, wasn't satisfied. He stood, took a step towards Steven, and shoved him. Art. The diner went quiet for a moment. Glasses rattled. A plate clattered to the floor. And still, Steven didn't react. The young man grinned, thinking he'd won. The others circled, whispering, egging him on. "What are you waiting for?" one whispered. "This guy's nothing." Steven slowly turned his head, his eyes meeting theirs, not with anger, not with fear, but with calm precision. Every muscle relaxed, every movement controlled. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to move quickly. His presence alone demanded attention. "Walk away," Steven said softly, almost a whisper. They laughed again. One of them reached out, trying to push him again. And that was the mistake. Because what they didn't know, what no one in that diner knew, was that they had just picked a fight with a man who had spent his entire life mastering control, precision, and deadly efficiency. A man whose silence was stronger than their bravado. The kind of man who didn't need to prove anything, until he chose to. And in a second, everything was about to change. Backhand index pointing right. What would you do if someone shoved you in public? Would you fight back, walk away, or freeze in fear? Most people in the diner had no idea who they were dealing with. To the casual eye, Steven Seagal was just an older man, sitting quietly at a corner table, sipping his coffee like anyone else. His worn leather jacket wasn't flashy. His jeans weren't designer. His black sneakers had seen better days. Nothing about him screamed martial arts legend or Hollywood action star. Nothing about him said former law enforcement officer or man trained to remain calm under life-threatening situations. And that was exactly why the bullies thought they could have fun with him. They saw the silence, the calm demeanor. They saw what they assumed was weakness. But appearances can be deceiving. Steven Seagal wasn't there for fame. He wasn't there to show off or to prove a point. In fact, he rarely made public appearances without cause. Most of the time, he traveled quietly, avoiding attention entirely. Cameras, reporters, fans, he avoided them all. And yet, here he was, completely unannounced, in a small diner in the middle of nowhere, minding his own business. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scowl and too much confidence, whispered something to his friends. They chuckled and nodded, eyes fixed on Steven, ready to provoke him further. "What do you think he's going to do?" one asked. "Nothing," the leader said confidently. "Old man can't fight us." They didn't know the decades of training that had shaped him. They didn't know the countless hours he spent mastering Aikido, perfecting every joint lock, every throw, every movement so precise that it could stop a grown man instantly. They didn't know the battles he'd faced, from the streets of Japan to the sets of Hollywood. They didn't know the physical conditioning, the mental discipline, the calm and control that came from years of mastering his body and mind. To them, he was invisible. Just another quiet man sitting alone. But there was one thing they didn't realize. Being underestimated was exactly how Steven Seagal had trained his entire life. He had spent decades learning that control beats rage, precision beats chaos, and patience beats arrogance. The diner's other patrons glanced nervously at the scene unfolding. They sensed something off but couldn't put their finger on it. Something about the older man's calmness, his stillness, his unwavering focus. It made the air feel tense. Steven didn't raise his voice. He didn't make sudden moves. He simply observed, waiting for the moment the bullies would make their next mistake. And in that silence there was power. A quiet, invisible energy that made even the boldest of the young men hesitate for just a fraction of a second. That fraction of a second would soon become everything. Because what they thought was weakness, was control. What they thought was silence, was readiness. What they thought was an ordinary man, was a master who had turned discipline into a weapon more powerful than brute force. And in just a few moments, they would learn the hard way that the quietest people are often the strongest. Backhand index pointing right. Have you ever noticed how people treat someone they think is powerless? How quickly arrogance can blind them. Steven Seagal remained seated, calm as a still lake, watching the bullies from the corner of his eye. The tallest one, the leader, wasn't satisfied with a simple shove. He needed to assert dominance. He needed to prove to his friends that he controlled the room. "Come on, old man," he sneered. "You're nothing. You think you can sit here like you own the place." One of the younger men laughed loudly, spilling soda onto the table. Another picked up a napkin and wiped his hands on Steven's jacket without asking. The arrogance was palpable. The diner had gone quiet. Conversations had stopped mid-sentence. The clatter of dishes faded. Even the waitress froze, uncertain what to do. There was something in Steven's gaze, something calm yet piercing that made the air tense. Still, Steven didn't rise. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply looked at them, his eyes steady, unflinching. The kind of gaze that makes even the boldest question themselves. "Hey!" the leader barked, stepping closer. "I said move." Steven tilted his head slightly. Not anger, not fear. Just focus. A single breath in, a single breath out. The second bully, smaller but quicker, reached over the table and pushed his shoulder. "Come on, fight me, old man," he laughed. And then, a subtle shift. Steven didn't move violently. He didn't lash out in anger. He didn't scream or threaten. He simply adjusted his position, his hands barely rising. But every move was precise, controlled, invisible yet undeniable. The leader stumbled backward, his confidence shattered in seconds. He didn't even understand what had happened. His friends froze. The second bully fell lightly to the floor, dazed, wondering how a man twice his age had overpowered him without a single aggressive strike. Other patrons whispered. Some tried to record on their phones. But Steven didn't care about witnesses. He cared about the lesson, the arrogance, the disrespect, because that's what this was. Not a fight, not a test of strength. It was disrespect. 7 minutes had passed since the first shove. 7 minutes where these young men believed they were untouchable. 7 minutes where they underestimated the quietest man in the room. Steven's presence alone made them rethink their choices. They had assumed he was weak. They had assumed silence meant fear. They had assumed that a calm demeanor was a lack of power. But arrogance has a way of revealing itself. And soon they would learn that true strength is measured not by how loud you are, but by how controlled, how precise, how disciplined. Steven remained seated. His breathing was steady. His expression unreadable. He didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He simply allowed the reality to sink in for the bullies. And in that moment, the message was clear. Disrespect the wrong person and consequences come faster than you can imagine. Backhand index pointing right. Has this ever happened to you? Being judged just by how you look? Underestimated because people assume silence or calmness is weakness. The diner fell completely silent. The clatter of cutlery, the low hum of conversation, even the sizzle from the kitchen, all seemed to vanish. The bullies stared at Steven Seagal, frozen, unsure what to do next. He stood slowly, every movement deliberate. His leather jacket creaked softly as he shifted his weight, and the silence became heavier, almost tangible. It wasn't anger that radiated from him. It wasn't aggression. It was calm control. Power distilled into presence. The tallest bully, the leader, finally found his voice. What are you gonna do now?" His words trembled slightly, betraying the sudden fear he couldn't hide. Steven said nothing. He walked toward them, each step measured. It wasn't a rush. It wasn't a charge. It was inevitability. Each motion had purpose. Each step carried the weight of years of discipline and mastery. The younger bullies exchanged nervous glances. They realized too late that they had no idea who they were dealing with. Steven stopped just short of the leader. The man's smirk had vanished. His confidence evaporated. He opened his mouth to say something, but no sound came out. With a calm hand, Steven reached into his jacket and pulled out a card. He placed it on the table in front of the leader. Slowly, purposefully. The card simply read, Steven Seagal, martial arts master and former law enforcement. That was all. No threats. No boasting. No unnecessary words. The room went silent, except for the shaky breaths of the bullies. The leader's face turned pale. His friends' laughter, the arrogance they had carried into this place, they were gone. In its place was pure, immediate understanding. They had underestimated someone far beyond their reckoning. You're Steven Seagal? One stammered, almost whispering. Steven looked at him calmly. Not a hint of anger. Not a hint of malice. Just observation. You don't get to push strangers around, he said quietly, his voice low, controlled, and cutting through the tension like a knife. You don't get to assume people are weak because they don't fight back immediately. You don't get to disrespect someone just to feel powerful. The youngest bully tried to speak up, to apologize, but his words faltered in his throat. Steven's calm gaze was heavier than any threat, stronger than any punch. It carried decades of experience, of knowing exactly how far a person could be pushed and exactly when to act. And then, with a simple movement, Steven signaled the end of the confrontation. He stepped back, relaxed. The tension in the room didn't dissipate immediately. It lingered, sharp and heavy, like smoke after a fire. The bullies sat frozen, realizing that their arrogance had been completely dismantled, not by shouting, not by brute force, but by control. Every patron in the diner understood what had happened. Not a single word was needed. The lesson was clear. Underestimate the wrong person and you will regret it instantly. Steven didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm alone had spoken volumes. And the truth was simple. This wasn't about fame. It wasn't about proving who he was. It was about showing consequences for arrogance and disrespect. The young men had thought they could assert dominance. They had thought they were in control. But in their overconfidence, they had forgotten one crucial thing. True strength often sits quietly, waits patiently, and only intervenes when absolutely necessary. That moment wasn't just a revelation. It was a wake-up call. Steven walked back to his booth, sat down, and resumed sipping his coffee as if nothing had happened. The bullies remained frozen, their faces pale, their egos shattered. And everyone who had witnessed it knew one undeniable fact. Sometimes silence carries more power than the loudest yell, and calm control can teach a lesson that no anger ever could. Backhand index pointing right, and this was only the beginning. The diner was still quiet. The air was thick with tension, like a storm waiting to break. The bullies sat frozen, staring at Steven Seagal, their faces pale and minds racing. It was then that a young employee who had been working in the back office of the diner stepped forward. He held a small folder in his trembling hands. His voice shook as he spoke. They were planning something, he said. The group you just taught a lesson to, they weren't just bullies. They've been involved in scams, thefts, and threats across town. There were other people who could have gotten hurt. Steven didn't flinch. He listened quietly. His calm gaze never left the young man. Every word the employee spoke only confirmed what he had suspected. Arrogance often goes hand in hand with ignorance, and ignorance can create danger. The bullies shifted uncomfortably. They had thought their mischief was harmless. A shove, a laugh, a little intimidation. But in truth, they were part of a pattern of recklessness that affected others. They had assumed no one would notice. No one would stop them. But Steven Seagal had. He stood slowly again, the weight of his presence filling the room. He wasn't angry. He wasn't vengeful. He was simply resolute. You see, he said, his voice calm yet powerful, disrespect doesn't happen in isolation. Every choice you make, every moment you think you're clever, it ripples out. It affects others. Sometimes in ways you don't even realize. The leader of the bullies swallowed hard. His smirk was gone, replaced by fear and shame. He looked around, seeing the reactions of the diners, people who had once whispered about Steven's age, about his quiet demeanor, now silently acknowledging the power and wisdom he carried. Steven continued, pacing slowly now, his movements deliberate. You didn't just underestimate me. You underestimated the consequences of your actions. You assumed strength was about noise, about force, about intimidation. But real strength, real power, is about control, discipline, responsibility. He paused and looked at each of them individually. His calm gaze was like a mirror, reflecting their arrogance, their mistakes, their recklessness. They were planning more than just small crimes, the young employee added nervously. Financial scams, hidden threats, jobs at risk, people hurt without even knowing why. If you hadn't interfered, or if someone else had ignored it, things could have gotten out of hand. Steven nodded, acknowledging the gravity. Exactly. And that is why lessons must be learned. Not through anger, not through chaos, but through understanding consequences. Because arrogance blinds people. And when people are blind, mistakes escalate quickly. Very quickly. The bullies shifted again, unable to meet his eyes. For the first time, they realized that they weren't dealing with a man who sought to prove himself. They were facing someone who had mastered the art of observation, who had lived a life where patience and discipline outweighed impulse, and who could dismantle arrogance without ever raising his voice. Steven's tone softened slightly. I didn't come here to punish. I came here to reveal the truth. You chose disrespect, but now you understand how dangerous that choice can be. You chose arrogance, but now you see how powerless it can make you in the face of control. The diner seemed to hold its breath. Even the youngest patrons understood the weight of what had happened. This wasn't just a fight. This was a lesson on character, discipline, and awareness. You have a choice, Steven said finally. You can continue down this path or you can learn from this moment. Arrogance is a habit. Respect is a choice. Choose wisely. The bullies remained silent. Fear, shame, and realization filled the space where laughter had once lived. For the first time, they understood the magnitude of underestimating someone, of assuming weakness, of thinking that appearance defines ability. And the young employee, still clutching the folder, looked at Steven with awe. "Thank you for stopping them," he whispered. Steven nodded quietly. Sometimes stopping them is not enough. Sometimes they need to see the bigger truth. That their choices affect more than just themselves. That respect isn't optional, it's essential. For a moment the diner was still. No one moved. No one spoke. Every eye was on Steven Seagal, the man who didn't seek recognition, didn't crave attention, yet commanded it simply through presence, discipline, and understanding. And in that silence, the bullies finally realized the truth. They had not only been overpowered, they had been educated. They had not just been confronted. They had been revealed to the consequences of their arrogance. Steven sat back down, calm as ever, sipping his coffee. And the bullies? They sat in stunned silence, knowing in their hearts they would never forget this lesson. Backhand index pointing right. Should people like this be forgiven? Or should consequences always follow arrogance and disrespect? Steven Seagal sat quietly for a moment, letting the weight of the silence settle over the diner. The bullies still slumped in their seats, pale-faced, eyes wide, their bravado completely drained. Every muscle in their body seemed to tremble, not from physical exhaustion but from the realization of what had just happened. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. The quiet was louder than any threat. The tension in the air pressed down like a heavy fog. Every diner, every witness could feel the calm authority radiating from him. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to challenge, impossible to dismiss. Finally, Steven rose. His movements were deliberate, almost slow, each step measured and controlled. He walked to the center of the room and the bullies instinctively shrank back. Not out of fear exactly, not fear alone, but out of respect for the presence that could not be ignored. "I didn't come here to be recognized," he said softly, his voice carrying across the diner. It was calm, yet each word struck with clarity. "I came to see how you treat people you think don't matter. I came to see if arrogance could outweigh judgment. And I came to see if disrespect is stronger than discipline." The leader swallowed hard. We didn't know," he started, but Steven cut him off with a single gesture of his hand. "I don't want excuses. I don't want apologies that feel forced. I want accountability. And you will have it." The youngest bully, shaking uncontrollably, whispered, "Please, just don't." Steven's eyes softened, but his tone remained firm. "No one escapes the consequences of their choices. Not because I am angry. Not because I am seeking revenge. But because arrogance always reveals itself eventually. And the time for lessons is now." He paused, scanning the room, letting the weight of his words sink in. The other patrons watched silently. Even the waitress, who had been on the verge of calling for help, now understood the magnitude of the moment. "You have a choice," Steven continued. "You can continue down a path of disrespect, thinking strength is measured by intimidation. Or you can change. You can learn that true power isn't in pushing others around. It's in control, patience, and understanding the consequences of every action." The bullies didn't answer. Their pride had evaporated. Their arrogance had been stripped bare. They knew that arguing now would be pointless. They were powerless, not because of size, not because of age, but because discipline had overtaken chaos. Steven's gaze softened slightly, but his resolve remained unshaken. "Because real strength," he said, "is not in making others fear you. It is in knowing you can act, but choosing when and how and why. And the moment you misuse your strength, consequences follow. Always." At that, he stepped closer to the leader. The man flinched, expecting a blow. But instead, Steven placed a hand on his shoulder, not heavy, not threatening, just firm. "Let this be a lesson you never forget. Not because you were overpowered. Not because you were humiliated. But because you now understand the responsibility you carry with every action you take. Respect is earned through character, not assumed through arrogance." Outside, distant sirens began to wail. Someone had called the authorities, likely alerted by the earlier commotion. But Steven made no move to intervene further. He didn't need to. He had already delivered the lesson. The bullies, still trembling, finally realized that their lives could have taken a drastically worse turn. Their arrogance, their disrespect, their carelessness, they had been exposed. And the man who had revealed it? He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't thrown a punch. He had simply demonstrated control, patience, and clarity far beyond anything they had ever experienced. Steven turned back to his booth, sat down, and resumed sipping his coffee as though nothing had happened. The lesson was complete. The bullies were left to grapple with the truth. Arrogance can't hide, disrespect always carries a price, and discipline is stronger than chaos. The diner slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but nothing was the same. Patrons whispered in awe. Phones continued recording, capturing not a fight, but a masterclass in control. And the bullies? They sat, silent, humbled, and forever marked by the encounter. Backhand index pointing right if you believe respect matters more than status like this. The diner had returned to its usual rhythm, or at least it seemed to have. But anyone who had witnessed the earlier confrontation knew that nothing was normal anymore. The quiet murmur of conversation, the clinking of plates and cutlery, even the smell of fresh coffee, it all carried the weight of what had just unfolded. The bullies, once loud, brash, and full of arrogant confidence, sat huddled together in a corner booth. Their faces were pale, their shoulders slumped, and their eyes avoided not just Steven Seagal but everyone else in the room. The lesson had been learned, though not through fear alone. It had been learned through respect, discipline, and the undeniable presence of a man who had spent decades mastering both. Steven sat back at his original booth, unhurried, calm, and completely composed. The leather jacket, the jeans, the quiet demeanor, all of it was the image of control, patience, and authority. Yet he made no show of power. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His presence had already spoken volumes. The young employee who had earlier revealed the folder containing the bullies' hidden schemes approached slowly, his steps hesitant. "Sir," he said, voice trembling. "Thank you for stopping them, and for showing them." He trailed off, unsure if words could capture what had just happened. Steven looked up, his eyes meeting the young man's. "Sometimes stopping them isn't enough," he said quietly. "Sometimes people need to see consequences for their actions. Not to be humiliated, not to be punished unnecessarily, but to understand the truth. To understand that every choice, every act of arrogance or disrespect has a cost." The bullies, overhearing this, shifted nervously. One of them finally spoke, barely above a whisper. We didn't know." Steven shook his head slowly, not with anger, but with measured disappointment. "Intentions matter," he said, "but results matter more. Arrogance blinds people to both. And when you are blind, you cannot see the consequences of your actions until it is too late. You made choices that could have hurt others, and today you've learned the cost." For a moment, silence enveloped the diner again. It was heavy with reflection, with understanding, with realization. Everyone present could feel it, the raw, undeniable truth of what had happened. The lesson wasn't just for the bullies. It was for everyone watching. True power is not loud. True strength is not forceful. True authority is measured by control, patience, and wisdom. Steven rose once more, moving slowly to the center of the room. "Your lives don't have to be defined by the mistakes you make in moments of arrogance," he said. "You can change. You can choose to act with respect. You can choose discipline over chaos. But it starts with awareness. Awareness of yourself, your actions, and the people around you." The bullies looked at him, eyes wide, a mixture of shame, awe, and fear etched across their faces. They finally understood that their earlier confidence, their loud laughter, their sense of invincibility, it had been completely misplaced. They were not just humiliated, they were educated, corrected, and most importantly, given a chance to reflect. Steven returned to his booth, sat down, and once again sipped his coffee. The room was still tense, but the tension was different now. It was not fear alone, it was respect. Respect for a man who had never sought recognition but commanded it effortlessly. Respect for someone who had taught a life-altering lesson without shouting, striking, or humiliating. The young employee stepped forward again, quietly. "Sir, what will happen to them?" Steven's gaze softened, though it remained resolute. "They will remember this day for the rest of their lives," he said. "Not because I made them afraid, but because they now understand the consequences of their actions. That's often more powerful than any punishment. Real power isn't in forcing change, it's in teaching it. And arrogance always reveals itself when met with discipline." Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the diner floor. Patrons who had witnessed the events slowly returned to their meals, to their conversations. But the story they would tell would linger far longer. Not just the story of confrontation, but the story of control, wisdom, and the undeniable authority of a man who had mastered both body and mind. The bullies finally got up, moving hesitantly toward the exit. They were no longer loud, no longer confident. Their arrogance had been stripped away, replaced by a quiet understanding. As they left, they avoided Steven's eyes, not out of fear but out of respect. They had learned that some lessons cannot be taught with words alone. Some lessons must be experienced. And Steven? He remained seated, calm, composed, observing the world with the same quiet authority he had carried for decades. Not because he sought power, not because he wanted recognition, but because he understood the value of patience, discipline, and respect. The final truth of the day was simple. Real character is revealed not by how you act when everyone is watching, but by how you respond when others underestimate you. Real strength is silent. True power is patient. And arrogance always shows itself, eventually. As the diner slowly returned to normal, one thought lingered in the minds of everyone present. The quietest people are often the strongest. The calmest people are often the most in control. And the most underestimated are often the most capable. Steven Seagal didn't win because he was famous. He didn't win because he was strong. He won because he understood discipline, patience, and the value of respect. And he had taught a lesson that no force, no loudness, and no arrogance could ever undo.